Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be beginning the first thematic cluster of the symposium, which is Indian graphics. Our first speaker is Professor Christel Devadawson from the University of Delhi. I'll be giving you a brief about her and about her work. A Cambridge Nehru Scholar from Burton for her PhD, Christel Devadawson is Professor, Department of English, University of Delhi. Her most recent publication in the field of visual studies is Obedient Daughters and the Deployment of Graphic Stereotypes. She curated the exhibition entitled Legacies of Laughter, Legacies of Loss, Pictorial Satire in Post-Independent India for Samanvaya, the Indian Literature Festival 2015. Christel's books include Out of Line, Cartoons, Caricature and Contemporary India, and Reading India, Writing England. Professor Devadawson will be speaking about pictorial satire in the Indian cartoon. Without further ado, I invite Professor Christel Devadawson to the stage for her lecture.
Hello, and I want to thank the organizers for their enormous intellectual generosity in conceptualizing a thematic cluster like Indian graphics. Why I say this is, the whole notion of Indian writing in English for a very, very long time has both tapped into the strengths of conservatism and also suffered from its limitations. One of the strengths is the sense that this is a field that is more or less finite, into which we can, as it were, reach out and pick what works for us. Now that's one kind of a strength, but another kind of a strength equally, if not more, is the ability to disturb the field, to, as it were, fish in troubled waters. And I put it to you that the notion of graphics within this as a thematic cluster is one of those experiences. It's an experience that definitely frays the edges of Indian writing in English. It also opens up a space to, so to speak, toss a pebble, see what happens. So it's that kind of a space, and as I said, I'm very grateful to the organizers for this kind of intellectual generosity. And I also want to say that this kind of work is free, it's not cheap. This is something that all of us need to open our thoughts and our minds to. The fact that these are, in one sense, archives in the making. In another, these are being shared with us even while they are in the process of redefining, reconstituting themselves. And let me begin then by talking about what seems to be some of the strengths of archiving pictorial satire. I'll go on to disturb everybody, including myself, by then talking about the difficulties. Now, the first point I'd like to make is that when it seems to be, or when a nation state is consolidated, when it has stabilized itself, or when it is in the process of doing so, then it is that graphic satire enters, opens up the field, as happened in France, as happened in England over the 18th and 19th centuries, and, so to speak, begins to establish itself. Now, the problem with having 47 as a cutoff date is that, quite simply, India does not, despite the celebrated Tryst with Destiny speech, it does not sleep in a state of servitude and wake up with a sense of freedom. The relatively young R.K. Narayan at that time gives us that cartoon where two of his protagonists, he hasn't yet, Lakshman hasn't yet reached a point where he will give us the common man. This is one of the early precursors to that well-known figure. And this figure, this person is unhappy enough to possess a parrot that repeatedly calls out, what is independence? What is independence? Now, This is something that you will be familiar with even from your reading of newspapers today. The figure of the caged parrot. It's often invoked in CBI investigations when things don't go the way they are believed to go. We hear talk of caged parrots, individuals, institutions who keep their mouths shut or who are supposed to keep their mouths shut, but who occasionally let out the odd squawk. Now over here you'll see one of those odd squawks. This is 47, and this is Lakshman pointing out that even while everyone seems to be high on a sense of euphoria, is there such a thing as independence to be had for the asking? And this is a question that Pictorial Satire is going to repeatedly bang on about. The question as to what constitutes a kind of, I shouldn't just say stability, but a kind of composure. Yes, I think that's a better word. A kind of composure in the field, because when we look, and this is now at a very much later cartoon of Lakshman's, Lakshman is pointing out, or he has one of his people point out, here is our hero of the millennium. We can safely send him up into space because he's used to doing without anything, without lights, without water, without air to breathe, whatever. And why this is interesting for our purposes is because on the one hand, it shows us what might be conventionally described as the superheroism that we can expect from a developing economy. An economy that has nothing other than endurance to bring to the table. And the strange thing is, not so much that Lakshman should point this out. Lakshman is unforgiving, unsparing as always, even though there seems to be a mask of good-tempered middle-class civility. But the strange thing is, not that Lakshman should construct such a figure and signal his discomfiture with it, but the strange thing is that readers should be happy to accept this. Why should we be happy to accept that our superheroism that we bring to the table is about acceptance, about acquiescence, about doing without things, doing without light, doing without water, doing without perhaps anything other than the right to breathe? And this is where the sense of pictorial satire as being a subgenre that can sort of push the boundaries of so-called civil society to remind us of that which is not acceptable, that which should not be tolerated. This is where this subgenre comes, I won't say into its own because it's a remarkably poised subgenre, but it actually brings a sense of an ethical and a moral system to the bar. How do we look at ourselves? And look at the next representation. This is from Suraya and Nainan. Suraya doing the text, Nainan doing the cartoons. This is much later. This is, I think, somewhere in the early 90s. We have two people crawling toward a tap, one toward a light bulb, to point out that this kind of symbolism does not work in the kind of economy we have. These are mirages. If this is not shameful, quite honestly, I do not know what is, because it is not simply a matter of pictorial satire reminding us about that which we should have. It is pictorial satire reminding us about that which we should want, that which we should expect. And then we ask ourselves, but how is it when we allegedly got independence in 47? How is it that well into the 90s, the roti, kapda, makan trinity of symbols, how is it that these still have resonance? And I put it to you that it's barely possible that one reason why India as a nation state does not have a compelling presence to bring to the table is possibly because from 47 onwards, the boundaries that were established largely by an angry, disappointed, and ignorant administrative system that was pulling out. Possibly those boundaries don't have any particular value. Now, look, for instance, at the cartoons that we have, the first two, the two by Shankar. Shankar is doing this, right? The first one is just before the war with China. Second is just after. And one of the things you will notice is that on the one hand, the mountains are unfailingly present. The natural scenery, the natural boundary, that's always absolutely in your face. But, and this is the troubling question, the fact is, even where there are natural boundaries, are they any help in keeping out less than perfect neighbors? And the answer is no, because as the much more recent, this is I think 2012 cartoon by Navarre shows, why is it impossible to keep China out? Possibly because China is already in. The level of political, social, and cultural infighting that distinguishes the Indian political class, that is something that makes absolute nonsense of the boundaries that an all too munificent nature has provided the subcontinent with. Because China is laughing, as you can see from that representation. There is no sense that the notion of India is a stable given entity. And if we can now go forward and look at the next slide, you will notice that okay, we said where there were natural boundaries, of course, pictorial satire can exist, and equally it's nonsensical, it doesn't. But think about where there are no natural boundaries. Think about the possibility that when we talk about Pakistan as though it is somehow as much of a given as ourselves, we are hanging on to that utterly frail, preposterous barbed wire fencing. It's not more than that. Indeed, very often it is less than that. Stones, mountain ravines, down which unfortunate civilians very often happen to stray. So, if you look then at that utterly preposterous fence of barbed wire, you will notice that it's not merely ineffectual in a way that, say, the mountains in the previous slide were ineffectual. It reminds the reader time and time again that this sense of a boundary is perhaps a little overstated. And why is it an uncomfortable situation with which to live? Two reasons. First, and very clearly, the situation that we have on our borders, like a great many other situations in life, is largely the product of people looking at it in a mistaken, blinkered, willfully obtuse manner. Do please take a look at John Kerry and Barack Obama assuring each other that there's absolutely no difficulty. Nothing at all will happen. Why does nothing at all happen? Not, and this is where the cartoon comes in, not because there is peace. Quite the contrary. We have this insistence, and this was something that the Manchur cartoon also shows, that the level of negotiation is pegged at an unbelievably low point. Now, this is not a social comment. This is not to say that jailers have no place in ordinary life, no. But think a little about the expectations that ride on a remark like, let us start with jailer level talks. It shows us, doesn't it, that there is that hope has more or less walked away from the situation, that when people have no expectations of policy is not going to elevate itself, it is not going to refine itself. And why is this? Largely because, and this is where the third cartoon comes in, is there any clear understanding either on the subcontinent or of the subcontinent? Is there any clear understanding at all? Not just as to what constitutes India, but as to the presence or absence of India and Pakistan from a debate that surely concerns themselves. Because the point that is being made is not these are two valuable emerging democracies, let us help them, but these are two losing developing economies that most unfortunately have got their hands on the nuclear bomb. Hence the conflation of those terms, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, to not just evoke the horrors of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but to remind us that any future conflict will not just be nuclearized, it will also be a complete debasement, not just of trying to recall the past in terms of names that make no sense, but of trying to look at the present again in terms of names that make no sense. So the whole notion of what the liberal left has called the idea of India is repeatedly examined, repeatedly revisited, upended by the subshore. And again, when we think about Sri Lanka, I mean, on very rare occasions that we do, we tend to think of Sri Lanka as not just the island that is somewhere or another near India, but also we tend to think in terms of relative size. India is huge, therefore it can be a regional bully. Sri Lanka, of course, is that tear-shaped drop in the middle of the Indian Ocean that can be dealt with very easily. Except that it's the reverse of true, isn't it? Because if you look at the cartoons, you will see two or three things at work. One, you will see Sri Lanka time and time again insisting that the Tamil minority within her territory is for her to deal with, not for India to deal with. In other words, that complete severance of what we like to think of in India as a continuing ethnic bond or a continuing emotional bond, that has absolutely no relevance or resonance at all. To a point where, and this is one of the strange features you will see as we move from the second to the third cartoon. The third cartoon should be about Sri Lanka if I were scrupulous in arranging my slides. I have deliberately not been that. Largely because we realize that with the passage of time and the evolution of historical and political necessity, what happens is cartoonists themselves, when they look at work that has gone before them, they tend to internalize, they tend to make material reality metaphorical reality. So in one case, where, as we see here in the second cartoon, the dangers of this situation, the dangers of the Tamils being exterminated from Sri Lanka without India being able to do anything about it. That these dangers, on the one hand, are allegorized as so many sharks with their fins alone sticking out over the water to identify them. But a later cartoonist, Shreyas Navare, inheriting this very clear sense of Lakshman's work, he doesn't hold on to the image as it is given him. Just as well, images must evolve, images must change. But what he does instead is, he picks up what is fundamentally the same picture. The palm trees, the island, the ocean, the sharks. He picks this up and instead he converts this to an interpretation of a very different kind of a world in which Anna Hazare is seeking to establish the new civil society, the new political cultural accountability in India that has not happened so far. And what Navare does is to show us that Hazare's idealistic efforts to establish this kind of a new civil society are as uh, frail, as idealistic, as flawed as an earlier generation's attempt to establish an island of peace within the Indian Ocean ever were. So, what we have here then in the business of image making is not so much a replication of an image with a new meaning. It is an emptying out of the material meaning of one set of images and a flooding in of a new kind of reality, a new kind of perception. And you will notice that in both cases, India is the loser. India is, as it were, effectively islanded, effectively stranded in the middle of nowhere by players in the game, by historical forces that are very much more likely to overpower, to shrink and dwarf India. Which makes us ask then, if this is the state of things, what is, if any, the role of pictorial satire? And one of the answers that repeatedly comes, it comes in this case from Vijay, a cartoonist, a writer of fiction, a writer of discursive prose, who repeatedly points out that the business of pictorial satire is not merely to remind people of what should be. It's not even to castigate people for failing to come up to the mark. It is with the business of keeping historical witness. And witness is always a very difficult kind of concept, largely because it involves taking some sense or taking some cognition of a range of competing forces. Now, in the 70s, particularly in the second half of the 1970s, India was particularly hit by a sequence of droughts, famines. Kalahandi in 78 was particularly the site of the most horrifying debasement of humanity. People sold their children, people ate their children, people left their children to die because there was absolutely no other way out of the Kalahandi famine. And it was not merely people living in Kalahandi, Orissa who were affected. It was something that completely devastated all of India. It made nonsense of the then government's attempts to feed everyone, to somehow show that India was making progress. And you will see from the Vijayan cartoon that he has his little boy, the boy who is one of the focalizers of his cartoons, with his mother, walking 10 kilometers for one pot of drinking water and then having to walk back all over again. So when Vijayan was asked about Kalahandi, it was also, by the way, the era of Bofors, and Vijayan points out that Kalahandi devastates India even more than Bofors does. But, and this is the interesting point he makes, he says all of us who live in a developing world, we cannot afford to take the same subjects, we cannot afford to take the same points of view that the developed West has, because at that point there is a campaign being conducted by the Coca-Cola company urging everyone to drink Fanta. And it was an award-winning campaign in the United States where it originated. And the slogan was, "It's fun to be thirsty." But it isn't good, it isn't fun to be thirsty in Kalahandi. That is the point that Vijayan makes, that pictorial satire does not, as it were, come from a level playing field, nor does it establish a level playing field. It draws the attention of those who look at it to the inequalities, to the very painful, very shameful gaps, disjunctions, areas of failure that we have. And time again, this is a subgenre that will assert its continuing right, not only to contextualize tragedy, but also to show us where, as a nation state, we have failed our leaders. It's not a simple thing of saying, oh, our leaders have failed us. If you take a look at the first cartoon, it's Lakshman's assessment of Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. Now, if you take a look at that huge hole in the wall, it's a common image that Lakshman uses when he wants to show that not just that there is a breakdown in things, but also that through breakdowns, through gaps, through failures, corruption enters the world. So Lakshman is unsparingly critical of Mrs. Gandhi's regime even at the point of her death, because the point he makes is not just corruption is there, but if we are to think about what has killed a person, if we are to think about what has killed a civil society, well, we have to face the fact that there is a very close connection between conducting or misconducting governance and paying a certain price for it. And pictorial satire in India is very, very quick to either commemorate or castigate people as we look back on their life's achievements. Now, in contrast, when Nagarey, for instance, wants to elevate Abdul Kalam, the president, in his death, he blacks out everything else so that Kalam's silver hair stands out as something of a halo, along with, as you will see, the atom, the symbol that is shown there. So it is a way of reminding people that you cannot only either pedestalize or castigate a person. You need to assess the impact of that person's total work. You need to have some sense of what I will call pompously the ethical compass of visual advocacy. Again, when it comes to this time, it's Sudhir Telang commemorating the death of M.F. Hussain. He doesn't have to say Hussain dies in self-imposed exile after how India has responded to him. What he does is he shows us a horse galloping out of its frame, a horse being one of the very frequently used symbols by Hussain of untapped energy and strength. The horse can no longer be contained in the frame, just as even before he died, Hussain was no longer, and this is something he said repeatedly in his interviews, he could no longer domicile himself with India on account of the continuing censorship here. This is what I meant by saying that pictorial satire as a subgenre is something of a custodian, something not just of a whistleblower, but something of an assessor. And again, when you get in the next slide, the different episodes, these are completely different episodes, I will allude to them. The Roop Kamar's Sati, which shocked the India of the early Rajiv Gandhi government, the Jessica Lal case that convulsed the India of the mid to late 90s, and then of course the Charlie Hebdo case that convulsed the world in the new century. The point that is being made this is by different cartoonists, Lakshman, Nainan, Nagarey, is not that death is to be either pedestalized or demonized, but that very often it provides a valuable moment for us as a civil society to turn around and think about what makes us like ourselves. Think, for instance, about the way, not just how Roop Kamar died, but think about the forces of sati, of dowry, of anti-women's rights, of a lack of education that bring about this death. If we say on the one hand, oh, William Bentinck abolished sati in 1823, and this is something that is happening in the India of the 1980s. Social and cultural evils are not easily exercised. They do not get up and walk away. They return. They return in a far more complicated, far more bedeviled form. And that is why you get in all three cartoons not a sense of grief at death, but a sense of tremendous loss, of tremendous horror, of the way in which civil society, both in India and in the world, is looking at itself, is unable to understand that not that humor is valuable, this is not a laugh fest, but this is an attempt to understand the extent to which a sub-genre may or may not go in taking forward its project of inquiry, which is why, and this comes out in the next slide, it is not simply a case of historical heroes or icons not being recognized because society has drifted away from them. That would be a very commonplace, elegiac point. Nobody makes it here, thankfully. The Ranga cartoon of Mahatma Gandhi, you'll notice that Ranga here doesn't merely make Gandhi into the Indian peninsula. He has Gandhi turning away. And time again people say, Ranga valorizes Gandhi. No, if he does that as well. But essentially, what he does is to point out that Gandhi cannot bring himself to look at the nation state he thought was being called into being. And therefore, even when in Nainan's cartoon, Gandhi turns up to watch Lage Raho Munna Bhai, he is turned away by the Darwan who says, you cannot bring this huge lathi into the auditorium. Very clearly, people are growing used to recognizing Gandhi on film. It's extremely difficult for them to recognize Gandhi in reality. It's also fortunate that we are not shown Gandhi brandishing the 500 rupee note, which in a massive and tragic irony carries his outline on it. And again, with the Vishwajyoti Ghosh cartoon of India in a state of ferment over the Anna Hazare movement, I love Anna is the t-shirt that everyone seems to be wearing, rather like I love New York. There's only one person who isn't wearing it. And the policeman on duty asks him, old man, who are you? Well, that is Anna Hazare. But the point that is being made here is not that India lacks heroes. India lacks the ability to recognize the heroic. And that is a very much more disturbing, very much more soul-searching difficulty to which pictorial satire alerts us. And I've somewhat meanly nicked the last slide from the work of a former student of mine. She is a graphic diarist, and she's in this. She recalls the journey her family makes from what was then Burma into India in 1945. And the comment that goes with it is, in times of disturbance, we cannot believe that there was a time when the red, white and blue Union Jack brought us solace. And I'll close with this point because surely it is one of the most shocking indictments of civil society. What we like to think of is civil society in India, that at even one fragment of our lives, we should ever think colonialism was that much more secure. Thank you very much for your patience.
Meenakshi, when you start teaching, you will learn that the request to come up to the front is one that is guaranteed to vaporize an entire batch. Don't make it.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you. My question was more to comment and it's broadly on your thing. It says archiving post-independent pictorial satire. Would you not look at pictorial satire itself as an archive? Is it not archiving and archive in that sense? Because I really like the cartoons you mentioned from Shankar, some of which appeared in his very famous weekly, which is again bracketed in two important moments of India's history, as in it began in 1948, just after independence, and ended in 1975 on the cusp of emergency. So to say, the last issue beginning with a letter from Indira Gandhi, which this is the Shankar story, the last one. So is it not archiving and archive? Is it a meta archive of sorts?
Yeah, I'll answer.
Thank you. That is a difficult question, and I hope I can answer it convincingly. My sense is this, that to constitute an archive, a set of texts must have a certain kind of intellectual time space to look back upon each other, to comment on each other, to look forward. There needs to be, in other words, a kind of a self-consciousness, the best kind of self-consciousness, where a subject is aware of its strengths, of its limitations, of its abilities to reach out. To my mind, I may be a little harsh here, but to my mind, pictorial satire in English newspapers, and journals, which is primarily what I've looked at. See, cartoonists sometimes show a very high level of self-awareness. Navare's debt to Lakshman, Vishwajyoti Ghosha's consciousness of Shankar's own ability to reach out laterally. It doesn't always happen. For example, if you look at the work of Vijayan himself has said time out of number. This is work that comes out of the Cold War. And the difficulty of therefore thinking about it as an archive in itself is simply this, that it's possible that it needs a little more time, a little more consciousness of other work that is happening in this field, other work that is happening in other areas of visuality. And it needs that time, and the great tragedy of civil society, as it insists on calling itself, is that it doesn't give the subshot that kind of time. If you look at the way in which the political cartoon has been marginalized to a point of non-existence in the daily newspaper, or near non-existence, you will realize that the ability to influence, the ability to think, to plan, to debate, that's an ability that seems to be slipping out of the grip of pictorial satire. Which is why I would prefer to use the verb rather than the noun.
At one point of the lecture, you said that the job of the pictorial satirist is to empty out the whole past material meaning and to infuse to the meaning, right? So I was thinking in that scenario, does it not undermine the job of the satirist himself, because the idea of a new meaning when somebody is training, it is always in danger of being capsized by any power distension or party, right? So I was thinking the idea of if the job of the pictorial satirist is to become a check and balance to how this society works, how does the idea of meaning come with to the hands of the satirist?
So maybe I was a little sticky there, because it's usually easier to hand out a list of tasks than to think about how they're to be done. But I would still say, not really, because the whole sense of hollowing out inherited meaning, infusing it with meaning, with fresh meaning, I would say that is in a way a fairly subtle and sophisticated complement of its own. It's not as though the cartoonist is sort of pushing away everything and saying, "Oh, I will have nothing whatever to do with it," but a person is holding on to the vehicles, giving them a fresh infusion of meaning. Now, in that particular example of Navare and his inheritance from Lakshman on Sri Lanka, the interesting thing is, while Lakshman goes on hammering away at the tremendous Indian myopia with regard to Sri Lanka, Navare takes it to the next level, the myopia of India about India itself. And I would say, therefore, that is not just a compliment to Lakshman, the using of the shark fins, but also it is a clear sense Not just that one road has come to an end, but another road is opening out. I think that that's bringing value to the table.
Hello, ma'am. This is comment rather than a question. I couldn't help think that it was worthwhile also to somehow archive the responses, Indian responses to pictorial satire. Considering any kind of, because not ever since Shankar, our first Prime Minister had once told Shankar that you shouldn't spare me. And the response to pictorial satire can be anything from a comment to a legal notice. And it would show, I believe it would show how India has changed or is changing, not just in its ability to take a joke, but also maybe in its ability to perceive itself.
Yes, I agree. And I would say that in one way, certainly the shift, the drift toward fundamentalism, as opposed to the responsibilities of citizenship, that is certainly something that is coming up. Now, the difficulty about chronicling Indian response is this, that different historical periods address themselves to different, naturally, historical concerns, emphases, whatever. You will recall that when the Shankar cartoon of Nehru whipping Ambedkar was run as part of an insert textbook, there was a huge outcry because people said this is a terrible slur. This is an index of the ongoing tragedy with regard to India's caste discrimination and perpetuation of caste discrimination. But the thing is that in Shankar's time, among other things, Ambedkar was also seen as a particular kind of a constitutionalist. And if there is a protest in this, I would say that the protest is shared by Nehru and Ambedkar against the far right that is doing its best at that time to derail the bill. And if Nehru is whipping or appearing to whip Ambedkar, he is actually whipping that terribly slow, terribly dangerous drift away from constitutionalism within the Constituent Assembly itself. I would say that, but as I say, different ages, different responsibilities, hence the difficulty of setting out a response. I don't think that's a very perfect answer, but that is, as of now, the best I can do.
Hello, my order. So my question was about the Amul advertisements, Amul butter advertisements, and would they also be examples of historical witnesses, like political satires as historical witnesses, or will they be the example of an archive of a commodity being placed in certain historical circumstances over time? So is it an archive of history or an archive of the butler's history?
I would say, I would say that the kind of historical testimony that the Amul advertisements offer, it has been worked on. I've done a little work on it myself, not a huge amount. Others have done a good deal. Most people argue that this is a good example of consumerism consuming itself, beginning with Graham Hagan, moving on to a great many other commentators. But I would like to twist the knife a little over here. I don't only think it is consumerism consuming itself. I also think that this is a genuine and therefore alarming example of the way in which visual politics can actually work more than one way, can appear to be radical when in fact it is tremendously conservative. And there is something strange, surely, about not the nature of witness, but the way in which that witness can, at one and the same time, seem to be playing on both sides. For example, at the height of the emergency, you have the Amul girl carrying this tray of needles stated for the purpose of sterilization. nothing that the then government ever put out by way of audiovisual publicity could dwarf the horror in that advertisement. And yet the advertisement was not meant to signal horror. It was meant to signal acquiescence, solidarity. That is, to my mind, totally horrifying. I don't think that makes the campaign a valueless campaign, but I do think it reminds everyone who watches the Amul ads well up to and including today. Visual testimony in and of itself is not above board. It is suspect. Like anything else, it is suspect, it is flawed, and we do need to maintain an unceasing vigilance on the point. I should add that some of my students who have worked much more in this case than I have done on Amul tell me that this is a sense of my being evil and anti-fat. They tell me this now. Whether they are right, we will have to leave them to decide. But as I say, the Amul girl is definitely someone who evokes very complicated feelings. Or rather, that campaign evokes very complicated feelings. The fact that it has been handled by 5 different people itself suggests the durability of visual testimony, and that again makes it very, very difficult to deal with.
I had a question. So when you look at I see how you call your lecture Pictorial Satire, but all the examples are from cartoons. So when we look at the most rampant form of Pictorial Satire today, which is the meme, at least in terms of circulation, when we look at the meme and we look at other forms of visual satire, such as stand-up comedy, for example, these are both forms that have drawn instant reactions from the political scene or from any institutions that they have been talking about. So from a form point of view, do you see any, of course there are parallels, but what do you think these forms have done to, Lakshman or Shankar's way of pictorial satire?
See, my sense of the meme, and for that matter, my sense of stand-up comedy, is that in one sense, both these subgenres tend to let their targets off the hook very readily. For instance, any stand-up take, say, on Shashi Tharoor, any stand-up take on the history of India from the East India Company to the present day, they tend to glamorize, they tend to fictionalize. And the thing with fictionalizing is not that it's bad, on the contrary, it's extremely good, but they therefore become that much more slippery, that much more difficult to interpret, because they glamorize that which they claim to satirize. Now, glamorizing is not a crime in itself, but it does indicate that these are forms that have more than one agenda. Well, good luck to them, but this is something that we do need to keep in mind, not because they compete with pictorial satire, but because these tell us something of the versatility and therefore the dangers of this subgenre. Meenakshi, you used a very good phrase, the curatorial process. I would say that the meme and the stand-up comedy don't always go through that process. Now, that may seem a very stuffy and a sticky way of responding, but see, it's sometimes many teachers will say, remember when you read, what you read on the net has not been peer-reviewed. And you say, in your mind when you're starting, you say, oh, stuff that, after all, I do need to get this done. But that is what I mean. That sense of peer review does require time, it does require vigilance, it does improve the subgenre which it scrutinizes. And I think the meme, particularly because it evokes immediate responses, viral responses, may not always have that. That's all.
Okay. I think that will be the question of the session. Thank you, Professor Devadawson. To deliver vote of thanks, I now invite the project assistant, Atul.
Hello everyone. It is my great pleasure to, on behalf of the IEEE online team, which includes the principal investigators, Professor Anna Kuri and Professor Pramod K. Nair, and the research and the project assistant Meenakshi and myself. I would like to thank Professor Christel Devadawson from Delhi University for, first of all, for coming here, and also for so graciously and so kindly putting up with all the interruptions which were sadly out of our control. So thank you for that, and thank you most importantly for this wonderful lecture. And Professor Devadawson also has an essay on our website, and I do hope that all of you can check it out on Indian Graphics. And next up, a big thank you to all the faculty members of the Department of English. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. Again, there are contributors there to the website. And a big thank you to all our volunteers, some of who are in this room, and many of them are still wandering around outside, arranging a lot of things for us. So a big thank you for them. And a big thank you to everybody in the audience. Thank you for coming. And this is just the start of the symposium. We have 5 or 6 more days packed with lectures, conversations, and so on. So please do come, and we'll have snacks and lunch as well. So this is like a bait to have you all coming in the subsequent sessions. So please do come. And thank you for everybody in the tech support. Mr. Udaya is here, and everybody else. Thank you.